presentation, but she's nervous, so we're just going to show you the presentation here. And we had a problem with the mic, so in order for you to be able to hear what Ayse is saying, I just changed the position. I will be monitoring the chat on YouTube, so if you have any questions, please do ask. Thank you. We're ready.
For a minute, I thought the mic started working. No. Hi, everyone. Hi. It's lovely to see everyone in person, finally, after a couple of years. Yeah. Horror. You'll be horrifying. Yeah, hi. So today, my name is Ayse. If you haven't had a scare yet.
A huge pool of customers and helping them run their business even more effectively with tech solution.
Great. An event you will never forget.
One second, I need to.
This is from last night.
This is so weird. Can you still see it? No. Hello? At least it's working now, but yeah, I think I'm not going to use it. Thankfully, I am a loud person. Let me know if you cannot hear me. I will speak louder. Right. My name is Ayse, and today I will attempt at covering cloud security with an AWS focus, and we will deep dive and look into Cloudtrail, what Cloudtrail is from defense point of view, and we'll try and talk about it with regards to Mitre Attack framework. So who am I? My name is Ayse, spelled weirdly. I have been a member of Ladies of Hacking Society, Ladies of London Hacking Society since 2018. Been attending events on the north most of the time, following online, etc. To everyone watching it live. I am a senior cloud security engineer at JetSeaTakeaway.com. I have been with Jet for just under a year. So I am architecting and engineering with a cloud security focus, mostly focused on AWS, a little bit of GCP as well. And before my engineering career, I was involved in operations, security operations, monitoring and incident response for a number of years as well. What I'll cover today is, I'll talk about Mitre Attack framework in general. We had an online session the last time, and we talked about Mitre Attack framework and on a high level what it is, etc. So I'll do a very short recap of it. So hopefully, assuming that you got a high level knowledge of that, which I'm sure you have, and then I will talk about cloud security in general, again on a high level. Then we will look into why is, what it consists of, what the components are, and how we can utilize it, can we map it to the Mitre Attack framework for detection? And I will also look at interesting event names within Cloudtrail logs that will help us with our detection. We will also look deep dive into IAM side of it. I'll show a couple of examples with that as well. And finally, I'll talk about how we can utilize with existing tools, new tools, expensive tools, or homegrown tools, and all that fun. So, as everyone knows, Mitre Attack framework has been around for a while. Initially came about as an internal project, and then sort of first in the US, gained popularity, and now all around the world. It is used by red teamers, blue teamers for defense. Lately, there have been projects on Mitre Attack, but the defend side of it as well. So it's really a step forward in maturity of understanding attack tactics, techniques, and procedures, processes. So predating TTPs, I also worked with a lot of IOCs, and I'm sure there is still a lot of use cases for IOCs around, but it was a really good big step forward.
Say them in full. What do they mean?
Indicator of compromise, indicator of compromises. So, like I said, there's still valid, there's still a lot of use cases for it, but it was indicator of compromises. Those indicators were on their own, sometimes lacked context, sometimes too isolated. So Mitre brought about that context, that connection to the entire kill chain. So from that point of view, in terms of maturity, I think having TTPs around have been a bit of a step forward in this part of the world. So, and I had shown the last time as well, Mitre Attack Framework has their own navigator. It's brilliant. Definitely go on the navigator itself and play around with it. There are a lot of options of matrices that you can see. One of the matrices, sort of a head matrix which has sub matrices, is cloud security. It has infrastructure as code. It has infrastructure as a service, software as a service, Office 365, etc. Some of these options. I would say it's still evolving. There are definitely things that are missing in there, and feel free to have a look at it. And there are some independent projects that are putting together matrices like this one. This is a Cloudtrail and Cloudtrail only Mitre Attack matrix. No, it was a, I can't remember the name. It was a group. They had a GitHub project. They had put this together. It's in the references at the end. You'll be able to see the website for this. There is a lot of, as you can see, tactics and techniques here, which would be impossible for us to go through all of them. And they're all very relevant. So it's not like Cloudtrail is this new alien type of log that never existed. It's in principle and practice, they're all very similar, but certain services, certain ways of these logs getting logged, etc. They provide different values. So it also helps to have a different matrix for Cloudtrail only. So when we look at cloud security in general, not even considering just AWS, but in general, there is what whoever talks about cloud security, there's one thing that they always start with, which I will start with, is the shared responsibility model. It's boring to hear. It sounds like it's the same thing all the time. What it is security of the cloud, security in the cloud. Security of the cloud is the responsibility of the cloud provider, like AWS. Security in the cloud is the customers, who have their environments infrastructure on the cloud, their responsibility. It is not just that. Another thing to consider, always consider with shared responsibility model is the services that we use as well. So there are many different services that AWS offers. Some of them are less managed than others. So when we look at shared responsibility, we should also look at how managed these services are and which part of it will be our responsibility to look after security-wise. So when a lot of organizations, they migrate to cloud, let's say they're on-prem to cloud. A lot of organizations are born in the cloud. So for many of them, the situation is different. If they're born in cloud, they tend to use a lot of cloud native security services, cloud native tools, etc. But if we're talking about a migration, then we're also talking about security tools and controls that we already have in place. So what do they mean? How do they relate to cloud? So these are all important points to consider when we're thinking of cloud security. Another point is we must know our architecture really well. By that I mean our application and the infrastructure that come with it. In order to put in security controls, we really need to understand it well. So that requires working with different teams, platform teams, application teams, whichever way we look at it. From, are we doing threat modeling? You need to understand that. Are you doing defense and you're going to put in detection rules? You still need to understand how it works. Otherwise, you'll have a lot of false positives in your hands. There is for AWS, there is a really good maturity model that they had put together. This is really good. It's not an exclusive, like exhaustive list of everything you can do, and also it may have their own services that they promote within this, which will obviously cost-wise you need to think twice. This is not the only way, but the options that we have, and there will always be alternatives to putting controls in. Again, I'm not going to go through it, but I linked it on the presentation we can share on.
I like this. I think I'm going to make it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I think this was like 5-6 months ago it was released, and they're still working on sort of enhancing it and making it better. Yeah, so like I said, today we're going to talk about Mitre Attack framework from more of a defense point of view. We're going to look at Cloudtrail from detection point of view, but Mitre Attack framework can also be used as a threat modeling tool, and as opposed to other threat modeling ways like Stride, for example, there are definitely advantages and benefits to it. So what do we do about cloud security? So whether it is a greenfield, no security controls in place at all, or there's migration, there are some security controls, I would always start with scoping and start small, but prioritize and start implementing. And we will look at that later on, what I mean about this in terms of Cloudtrail as well. So what is Cloudtrail gonna do for us? So it will provide us detailed visibility into all the API calls that are made on the cloud environment by users, services, other resource activities, etc. We can also utilize this for non-security purposes like track and troubleshoot infrastructure changes. So you will get a whole lot of other teams utilizing Cloudtrail logs as well. Most importantly, we can use these logs to build detection mechanisms based on these recorded API calls. Again, I will talk about when Cloudtrail is not always the answer and what other alternative controls we can put in place later on as well. We can use it as instant response investigation tool, You can view, search, download, archive, event activity for alerting, threat hunting, post investigations, lessons learned. There's also, not mentioned here, regulatory and compliance, reasons why you would need to keep the logs for a certain period of time as well. So what is it exactly? There are audit logs of all API requests, like I said, to perform an action within AWS service and its resources within a specific period of time in an AWS account. Most of the time they're in they have a similar structure. However, because they are service dependent, their components and different parts may be different depending on the cloud service that you're using. So your cloud environment is AWS, and you have Cloudtrail enabled. What happens is Cloudtrail event history comes enabled by default, and that gives like 90 days access to logs. It's very, very basic. We're not talking about having trails. We're not talking about storing these logs. We're just talking about having access to them only for 90 days, one region at a time, and events. You can download them as CSV or JSON objects, but you won't have them stored
Is it free?
all the time. This one is free, yes. This one is free. The other one is too. So Cloudtrail Trail, again, it's the same thing, but what you need to do, you have to enable it. Cloudtrail Trail, as you ask for cost, about cost, Cloudtrail Trail is free for one trail per account per region only. So you can have several trails enabled, but only one will be free and you'll be charged for the other ones. So it's important to cleverly enable the trail and have them consolidated into one place, and then you'll be able to do a whole lot more after that. There's a lot to talk about the architecture of Cloudtrail itself, but that's not what we're looking at today. It's available more than 90 days, obviously, because it depends on how you're going to store them. You can have the trail enabled and have it stored in S3 buckets. So you can enable the multi-region per account. That's the ease of having enabled it, but still it's a regional service, so you always be getting involved in dealing with regions when you're working with Cloudtrail. So there are some native tools that you can utilize for querying the Cloudtrail logs. There are metric filters we can set up on, for example, CloudWatch. You can use EventBridge service. There's a lot of AWS services I'm talking about, but feel free to ask interview and ask for about any service you would like. I'll be able to explain. Yeah, there's a lot of signal which here. Sorry. EventBridge, Athena. So EventBridge is basically event-based rules that you can have. So those rules can use Cloudtrail logs natively without you configuring anything. You can do whatever with it. You can have alerting in place. You can get it sent to a Lambda function, which will be a script that you can use, to do anything else. Athena is to be able to query it. Nowadays, AWS has released Cloudtrail Lake, another easier than Athena. It's like a managed Athena where you can query Cloudtrail logs. It's expensive, but if you don't have any theme in place at all, then it definitely is an option. And Cloudtrail Insights comes by default, so when you have the trails enabled, you'll be able to utilize insights to query. Filtering is really limited, and you'll be able to do object-based, which means you're only looking at, for example, one environment, one date, one set of logs, etc. So what type of events do we have within Cloudtrail? We have management events. These are, when you enable Cloudtrail, management events get enabled by default. Most of the API calls, they are under management events. There are options of enabling data events and insight events. So data events, you can get S3 object events, Lambda execution events, DynamoDB events, read, write, S3 object events can get object level insight into the Cloudtrail logs as well. And then you can record. You can also have logs recording unusual call volume of write management of APIs in the insight events. These are optional, and if I was enabling these for any organization, any project, I would definitely look into scoping, prioritizing, and seeing what the purpose of it is, and then going ahead and enabling, because it will definitely cost a lot. Right, so we have a Cloudtrail log. Like I said, Cloudtrail logs are designed and provided by each AWS service separately. Usually at AWS, these services are managed by different departments and teams. So although they try and have consistent components within Cloudtrail, sometimes these differ. So the fields that you will get within the Cloudtrail log may be different. Most of the time, these who, what, when, how, result will be there, but service dependent, there may be some other fields that we can utilize for whatever purpose as well. So in the who section, you will find user identity, ARN, that could be an IAM user, it could be an IAM role, it could be an external identity that has access to the cloud environment. You can find the source IP address, you can find the user agent. These are all very interesting and good fields for us to, especially if we are building detection rules around whichever environment utilizing Cloudtrail. So now that we have sort of understood on a high level what Cloudtrail logs are and what the different fields are, and we have a list of requirements, list of priorities, would like to it's so random. Threw me off. Right. So what sort of activities can they provide for us? Like I said, there are so many tactics and techniques to go through. I will look at the ones I worked with a lot, initial access, persistence, privilege escalation. What can we see within these Cloudtrail logs? We can see activity, exploiting, for example, public-facing application if we're capturing logs. How can perpetrators gain other ways of initial access? There could be trusted relationships, trusted identities that have access to AWS, or they could just get hold of valid accounts of individuals or service accounts to the environment itself as well. What other things can perpetrators do? They can manipulate accounts to authenticate with one, and then create, for example, another account that has higher privileges. Or they can create an instance, an EC2 instance, or a container image, or a Lambda function, and they can give an IAM role to this service, and they can establish persistence and escalate their privileges. Other ways of manipulating, for example, snapshot and backup services to access resources. There are so many of different ways of utilizing already available services for malicious purposes out there. The list is endless. And there are always new ways coming out on how they can, perpetrators can utilize this. The last one I read, for example, was using S3 replication. So it's like a legitimate service that AWS provides to S3 users to replicate across different regions. And what you can do is you can utilize that function in order to gain privileges, and you don't even need privileges actually. A lot of the times it's given. It's considered as a low privileged activity. What you can do is you can exfiltrate a whole lot of data, and if you don't have detection in place, most of the time organizations, for example, wouldn't, because no one thinks that you can use.
Off the land, but on AWS instead of machine.
Yeah, so you basically making it look like you're replicating to another region, but you're exfiltrating or circumventing the detection in place in just one region, and that's another complexity that cloud brings in. You know, our detection is always looking at all regions, for example. So event names are, like I explained here in the what section. Event name, I would say, is one of the most important fields within the Cloudtrail logs. It will tell you exactly what the API call was that was made. So there is I'll give you the reference later on. There was a security vendor who put together this sort of Mitre mapping of all event names, most of the event names, the most popular ones, to sort of a Mitre Attack framework, to the tactics. And the ones that I found really, really useful were the initial access and privilege escalation. These are the event names that you can use in your querying and alerting. So for example, abnormal create user after a root login, for example, would definitely be always considered abnormal activity, because you wouldn't really want your root account to be logging into the account, but also you wouldn't want that, you wouldn't expect that sort of activity from a root account unless there's an emergency. So you can then start building these cases and scenarios where you feel like it's a suspicious activity for your environment, and then build the queries and the detection rules around event names like this. So this is the full mapping that they had done. I found it quite useful. I don't think this is an exhaustive list. It doesn't have all the event names, but it definitely helps identify which event names mean for what. They're also sort of not exclusive to these tactics. So for example, you can still look, I'll just give an example. You can still create persistence. You can create a role to be persistent, but you can also create a role for privilege escalation. Like I said, you can create a new service if your permissions allow to create a new service within the account, and you attach a new role to this resource. For example, a Lambda function. You attach a new role, execution role, to this Lambda function. Then you might be doing persistence, but also privilege escalation, but also preparing for laying a bed for the exfiltration, or persistence because you will. It's like a plan B thing where you're doing your own thing, but that's your backup plan in case you lose the permissions, valid permissions that you're using. So it's not necessarily exclusive, but it definitely helps paint a picture. So another field, I'll take a step back here. Like we said here in user identity, in the who section, another field that is really, really important, I think, in whether you're putting in detection rules, whether you're doing investigations, whether you're the red teamer trying to, find a way of getting in. User identity section is the most important thing, especially for access. So this IAM identity comes with different types of there's authentication, there's different types of authentication. So you could have an IAM user, and that IAM user will have a user identity ARN attached to an IAM user. like we will see here. You could have a IAM user authenticating with an access key. You could have an IAM role with an external identity provider, or you could have an IAM role for a resource like EC2. So these are sort of samples from Cloudtrail logs. If you take a look at the, this is the user identity section. If you take a look at the access key ID on the IAM user authenticating with an access key, you will see a key here. So that's a good indicator for us to say this is an IAM user and it is authenticating with an access key. If it's an IAM user, so for example console login, then we will see Ayse here. That's how I'm pronouncing it. A lot of the times organizations have external identity providers. So what happens to users, human users, is that they need to assume role, like it says here. And most of the time, we will see access key ID for that is going to be Ayse as well. This is important for, I found this bit especially important for investigation cases where I had to find really, really quick information about activities. And it's the same with IAM, for example, for EC2, for IAM role, access key ID has the unique ID starts with Ayse.
Why was the first one quite IKEA and the rest Ayse?
This is a human user that's using access key, and the other one is a console login, so it's a different API call, and with the IAM role, if you're not an IAM user, it means you're using the authentication for the authentication bit. You're using an external identity provider to authenticate, and then the role itself gives you the authorization on the AWS side, and that's also Ayse. I guess the IKEA is the only one that's different. Is IAM user and proper access key, CLI access, for example. Right, so another Cloudtrail example. I call this an easy win. So one of the most important type of access to any AWS environment or account is the root access. It's the absolute first thing that you would get when you create an AWS account. You have to have it, and it's basically got the highest permissions ever possible. There is nothing a root cannot do on an AWS account. That's why it's very important to monitor root activity. And I call it easy win because it's actually really easy to identify this activity out of Cloudtrail logs. So it looks like this. You will see the type as root. Because it's not tied to an individual, it's not tied to an IAM user, it's not tied to a human using an external identity provider, assuming a role at all. It's not really very easy to say whether it's legitimate activity or not. Most of the time, organizations allow the use and monitor the activity within it. AWS best practices would say definitely do not use the root account for the activities. Have your proper IAM users and roles, ideally roles and permissions with least privilege in mind to use it. So how can we detect the root account if we already put in place such policy? There are different ways of doing this. So we can have, depending on what we would like to use. If you already have a SIEM in place and you're ingesting your Cloudtrail logs into the SIEM, and you have some rules and queries, detection mechanism in place, then that would be one of the options that you would go with. If you don't have a fully fledged sort of SIEM tool you're using, you can also detect, like I had explained in the beginning, yeah, you can also use CloudWatch, Event Bridge, for detection of these. So basically AWS's native services, you can put in detection in place. There are some recommended ways out there. I find the quickest way of identifying root access and the most effective way was having an event bridge rule in place, and the event bridge rule would look into natively Cloudtrail logs without you pointing to any storage, without you pointing to any SIEM, without you pointing to any other log aggregator, and then it will then send it to an SNS topic, and that SNS topic can be tied with the Lambda function, and the script can do basically what you want it to do. Would you like to be notified about it, via different channels? Would you like it to go on the on-call platform, for example? One of them, like for example, PagerDuty, for your on-call people to have a look at. So all that can be done AWS side rather than taking out. It leaves. It is the least. It's got the least latency within it, and the best way. Why the best way? Because AWS can actually identify root logins as well. So AWS Amazon GuardDT. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with it. GuardDT is basically machine learning based, looks at your environment, detects any unusual activity, learns what normal is within your AWS environment, and then and alerts you on these abnormal, unusual behavior. So GuardDT has a rule that will alert you on root login, root usage actually. So what happens is GuardDT will only alert you when there's an API call made by the root account, not when the authentication takes place by the root credentials. So if you're looking at getting detected, GuardDT may not be the best way. So you may be sort of like later down the line, you find out after the fact that the API call was made and the damage was in place. I would definitely recommend the AWS's native services for this. But when we're dealing with Cloudtrail, there are also some complex cases where you may need some correlation between different events. So for example, there is, so we have a dev account, we have a prod account. Alice is the malicious user, assumes a role within the dev account and assumes another role to access the prod account, and then returns temporary security credentials, and then uses accesses AWS by using these temporary security credentials to services like S3 and EC2. So as people trying to detect this activity cross-account, it's not very easy with Cloudtrail, because what it does is it provides you a request ID and event ID for that activity. For these two different activities, the request ID and event ID will be different. So you will not be necessarily able to identify that by that. It will have a shared event ID, and that's where you can start correlating the two together. User identity account of the source account, and the recipient account ID of the source account will be in the log for this. But what you're looking for in order to correlate is recipient account ID on the destination account on the other log that you're trying to correlate. So it gets really complex. If you're using a SIEM, it may be possible to have some advanced queries running and have detection that way. If you're not using a SIEM, AWS's native services may not be enough for this sort of correlation. But it's a layer game. There may be other controls and detection rules that you can put in place. So how can we utilize further Cloudtrail logs? Have a list of alerts use cases. That is definitely the point at which where I feel like, right, this is when I can start using Cloudtrail logs and querying these logs now. Make sure that if you're starting out, it's a greenfield, so you can start prioritizing based on risk, based on threat modeling. But if you already have some controls in place, you can use gap analysis that you've done on your controls, which ones you would like to address. You can also do threat hunting and then identify, come up with use cases and queries and alerts that way. This requires a really good understanding of Cloudtrail logs themselves. Like I said, it's not too difficult. You can sort of see the consistency across, but certain services, certain API calls have different fields for sure. One of the sort of another easy win for me was when you look at Cloudtrail logs, there is a field called read only, and if read only field is set to false within the Cloudtrail log, it means that there was a change made by whoever the actor was to the resources. So it was either, for example, create a new instance, it was deleting logs, it was creating a new function, etc. So that really helped me to narrow down the event names that I would like to look at, and then, you know, further down, fine-tuned what it is that I would like to get detected on. So scope and start with most important detections to you, like I said, based on the modeling, the hunting, the prioritizing, risk of the environment, cost considerations. So Cloudtrail is not expensive. It is free when you enable just one trail. It is fairly inexpensive to store in S3 bucket, especially when you're having sort of cold storage, hot storage for a certain number of days, and you can then have them archived using Glacier for cold storage, or you can have them ingested into another platform like any SIEM that you're using. Then you can make decisions on retention, etc., based on that. However, SIEM is not cheap. So if the organization is not using SIEM, that doesn't mean it's the end of the world when it comes to Cloudtrail logs. There are a lot of Cloudtrail parsers out there, a whole lot of open source scripts, tools, CLI tools, or tools that you can implement for ongoing alerting, like Cloudtrail bot, Trailscapers, or self-made Python scripts using Boto3 that will scrape Cloudtrail logs that are stored in S3 buckets. So SIEM is not the only solution when it comes to Cloudtrail logs.
Do you use all three?
Pardon?
Do you use all three of them? SIEM, Cloudtrail, and all the scripts?
Yes, because we have a SIEM, we have a SIEM in place, so we have the luxury of ingesting our logs into the SIEM that we use, which logs we want to, etc. We prioritize that as well. And there are also environments that where we don't ingest the Cloudtrail logs, and we have, for example, Cloudtrail bot running, parsing logs for the rules that we put in place. It's really helpful, especially for Cloudtrail bot one is really helpful for manual changes. So what we want is, we want all engineers to make changes using infrastructure as code, via the pipeline, But you will always get some manual of the console changes. So it's not necessarily suspicious activities, but also within your own organization, internal usage, your own best practices, you can just keep an eye on Cloudtrail logs and activities that way as well. It's also important to mention that Cloudtrail is not the only answer and always the answer. I explained with the root login, it doesn't have to be enabled for EventBridge to identify the root login, or CloudWatch to have what's called filter alerts to identify the root login. It basically is all down to your use case and what it is that you're trying to achieve, what the objective is for that detection. You may not even need to go to Cloudtrail at all. You may have other solutions like AWS's native one called config rules, and these config rules will identify changes as they happen. You can then have config rules attached with auto remediations that will revert the changes, so you're basically preventing rather than just reacting to it. There are open source equivalent to these, like Cloud Custodian, that will also keep an eye on API changes outside the Cloudtrail logs. So Cloudtrail logs are sort of like one step, so you're still one step behind, looking at what happened rather than preventing before it happens. But it definitely has a lot of use cases still. It is valid for detection. There may be many instances where you cannot put preventative controls in place. There may be cases where you just can't put in auto remediation in place, but you would like to just detect. Cloudtrail has a really valid use there.
Create your use cases for all of the three. Do some of them come with use cases in their solution already?
You mean?
Use case, like something suspicious that you think will be suspicious. Is it like defined somewhere? Is easy to access, or is it different?
Yeah, a lot of SIEM platforms, the big players like Splunk and Datadog and Logarithm as well, I think. They have like off-the-shelf rules for Cloudtrail logs. What I found though is you still need to customize a whole lot of them. You still need to, sort of dig into them and make sure they work, make sure they, alert you only when you want them to. It's good for a lot of them are good for metrics purposes, so you can see what's happening. But when it comes to alerting, you just don't want to get alerted on everything. So I always found the custom ones have worked better. So it requires the understanding of the environment, what it is that we want to get alerted on, etc. But there are obviously very easy ones like root login, EC2 security group rules changing, an EC2 instance in a public subnet that has inbound open from the world on SSH is definitely a no-go. So you want to be alerted on those straight away. If not, consider putting preventative controls. But yeah, it's off the shelf rules how. There are some, I saw some GitHub repos that had some queries that they had put in place, like for access, network, if you have VPC flow logs enabled, etc. So you'll be able to find a whole lot. But there is not one single place where either by AWS or a third party, not one single place where I found here are the use cases that you need. Plug these in and off you go. You're 100% sorted. And yeah, these are the references, some of the stuff that I refer to here. Any questions? Yeah.
So generally, AWS many solutions are expensive, and why in comparison to open source or SaaS companies and all that, right? So what's your argument for one should go towards AWS maybe two because they're good enough for the environment, or one could opt for the open source or SaaS solution?
Right. So it really depends on the problem you're trying to solve, I think, and the existing controls you have in place. So if you already have some existing controls, you can look into incorporating them. But I'm an open source lover. I absolutely love it, but I don't think open source is free all the time. You still need the time, you still need the skilled people, you still need to be able to implement, maintain. What I find though, if your scope is narrow enough and the impact is not too much, open source is definitely the way to go. So a while ago when I was looking into, not sure how familiar everyone is with AWS Config. Config is a service that identifies configuration changes. So it's not like a magic service. It's just think of like imagine you have an engine on AWS, and this engine has the right permissions and it's making API calls to ask, has this changed? Has that changed? And things like that. So you just define rules. And it does it. It's not too cheap, it's not too expensive. It can get really expensive if you have a lot of rules on many different regions for many different services. But there's an equivalence to it called Cloud Custodian, and that's open source, a brilliant project. If you implement it right, it's just amazing. So you will be able to get away with all the costs that you would do with Config. If we're talking about hundreds of accounts, hundreds of different environments, it would make sense to invest time, people into implementing Cloud Custodian in this scenario, and have the rules that way and your detection, then relying on the ease and the cost. Obviously, if that is you're not willing to pay. If you're willing to pay, then it's quite easy to implement config. So yeah, not always. Any other questions? Yeah.
What about parsers? I'm not sure whether it's necessarily relevant. Within our DevSec process, FXT, we have some issues with actually impacting runtime. So there's a little bit of having any type of runners in the background. Developers are often they question any type of security screening as such. So some of the open source ones you have you in terms of implementing in your environment, you then have pushback, or how would you try to integrate, I guess, monitoring?
Yeah. So yes, actually a great point, because it depends on the implementation of it. So if you're looking after your AWS architecture well, and you have Cloudtrail enabled, ideally you would have a dedicated security account or security OU. And within that OU, you would have, let's call log archive account. And you have all these Cloudtrail logs destined to this log archive account, all correlated in one place. So your implementation can just live there. You can pass as many logs, little logs as you want. This is if the engineers are not using the logs. And if the Cloudtrail logs are being used by other engineers for different purposes, for troubleshooting, for anything else, then you'd pay additional trails and things like that. So the implementation matters the most. With my implementation for Cloudtrail bot, it was per environment. I didn't have anyone complain. it was just a lot of false positives until you fine tune and reset it. The script was basically passing it for manual changes, and you need to define what the pipeline is, etc. So it was just us basically complaining about it, but no, I never had that sort of problem. But with an ideal implementation for that, for me, would be having all Cloudtrail logs, not just Cloudtrail, all logs. Like if you're capturing VPC flow logs, anything else, all in one account. Make it restricted, make it segregated, monitor the access around it, because it's really, really important to look after Cloudtrail trails themselves. Perpetrators can delete them if you allow whatever permissions for them to do, so they will just leave absolutely no trace at all. Yeah, in that sort of implementation, open source is sort of fine. I am a big fan of Cloudtrail, but whenever it's possible, in whichever scenario, I try and do other alternatives before I get to Cloudtrail. So what is the preventative method that I want to use? Starting from SCP. If SCP doesn't work, right, what is the auto-remediation I can put with custodian or config? If that doesn't work, do we want to monitor this? Any other questions?
Quite an advanced topic.
Yeah.
From your experience, which tool works best with Cloudtrail logs? I can tell I'm a very bad experience, so.
Right. I am aware this is being recorded. Right, I have POC'd a couple. Not Splunk. Datadog. I am not their ambassador or getting paid, but Datadog is very switched on when it comes to making sense of Cloudtrail events. Not just from UI perspective, but actual rules and detection perspective. I think everyone's sort of catching up with it still, even though it's been around for a while. It's and every new service, every change in a service is bringing a new scenario as well. Like with the S3 replication turned into exfiltration tool scenario. No more questions? Thank you very much for listening.